Thank you. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. I think I'll end up standing on this side so you guys can all see. So my name is Tiffany Hesser. As Nico was mentioning, I'm in the Chemistry and Chemical Engineering department. I've been a lecturer here since 2006. And one of my main interests is teaching and education, teaching technologies, teaching strategies, those types of things. So I'm always up for trying something new in the classroom. So that's how we ended up with this particular project. Here what we did is we incorporated iPads into the laboratory. So I'm going to share with you our experience in incorporating it into the lecture, but mostly how we incorporated it into the lab to create a paperless lab environment. Now, I'm not sure if everybody's aware, technology has been creeping into the classroom for quite a while now. It's creeping into many places in our life, but really it's starting to make its way as a valid method in the classroom now. K through 12 has started to increase its use also. So we currently have a huge focus in education on STEM education, with technology being one of those aspects. And recently we've been incorporating technology into K through 12 education as a way to incorporate those concepts and those different ideas from STEM education. This is possible now because 93% of K through 12 classrooms now have internet access in the classroom. And that's something that's increased significantly over the last few years. It wasn't always looked at as a priority. But now with introducing these new technologies, it really is required that we have internet access. The reason being is because some of these simulations and some of these games that we use in technology are, we can download them as apps on on iPads, or we can use them as programs on computers. But really, a lot of the new software that's coming out is going to need the internet access. So it's really important that we have that internet access in the K through 12 in order to be able to utilize this particular technology. Different things like 3D models, game simulations allow us to take these science concepts and apply them in a fun, engaging type of way. Especially something like the 3D manipulations, that's not just something that's isolated to K through 12 education. 3D manipulation of models is really important in something like chemistry, where these ideas are very conceptual in chemistry. We're trying to picture in our head what these molecules might look like, and if we twisted them, what they might look like from a different angle. And for students who aren't very good at that spatial aspect, these types of manipulations are these types of models are very, very useful for these students. So we're really seeing a lot of that happen in the K through 12 classroom also. Now, this is going to keep going, surprisingly enough. We expect this trend to continue in K through 12. A recent report that looked in the future towards 2017 anticipated that not only would we be introducing these into the classroom, but we're going to start using them to assess students at the K through 12 level. Here I included a little quote for you that just kind of summed up these last couple slides. Games have proven benefits in engaging learners of all ages and helping them better understand complex material. Taking that notion one step further, simulations and game-based scenarios enable students to apply what they've learned in a realistic environment and to get instant feedback. So the realistic environment and the instant feedback are really valuable in that young group for us. Now, if you've noticed, it's also crept into higher education. So we see a lot of technology here now. So it's not all fun and games, though, at this higher education level, where like what we see at the K through 12. So we're expecting to use this in the classrooms, and we're also expecting our students to be more comfortable with these devices. A recent study showed that college-age students use at least 3 different devices every day, and they don't go more than an hour without using one of those devices. I probably don't have to tell most of you that. That probably doesn't even need to be research, because we have the students for at least an hour and 20 minutes, so therefore within that hour we do expect them to pull their phone out at least one time to check the time, right? Or to see if anybody sent them a message or anything of that sort. And not only are they using them in their daily life, but they really would like to see them incorporated more into the classroom. The same study reported that most students would welcome an increased use of that technology in the classroom in some sort of educational way or in that learning process. And most of them do already use those devices for studying outside the classroom also. So they would like to see us try to incorporate that into the process a little bit more. Now, I've kind of been talking generally about technology and computers and devices, but now I'm going to specifically go over to iPads and looking at how iPads are being introduced at the higher education level. They are being used at the K through 12 level also. My children are in 4th and 2nd right now, and they have a weekly visit to the computer lab, which doesn't use computers. They use iPads, and they play games, and they have to go online and do online homework through their iPads every week also. So it really is making its way into the primary and secondary education. But we are seeing it also at the higher education level. A lot of these instances here that I'm going to mention to you are very recent, from 2010 really up to currently. St. Mary's University of the Adult Learning Program at St. Mary's University has incorporated iPads for all of its adult learners in that program. The goal for incorporating it at St. Mary's University was to take the classroom and social media and combine the two ideas together. So not necessarily Facebook, but the idea that the students could connect outside of the classroom in regards to classroom content. So they're sharing media, they're sharing information, they're sharing details, all in a social networking sort of way, but using the iPads and working it around course content. That, I believe, was 2010 that they worked on that. Duke University School of Nursing just incorporated iPads this last year for all of their nursing students to use in the classroom in a variety of ways that's specific to the instructors. Duke University actually in 2004 also incorporated iPods for all of their freshmen. So they passed out to all the incoming freshmen iPods in an attempt to try to start bringing some of this smart technology into the classroom also. There's really not any feedback on how that particular thing went. Maybe it wasn't that good. The University of Minnesota College of Education and Human Development, they recently introduced iPads for all of their 450 freshmen, incoming freshmen. So all the faculty got it, all the freshmen got it. They claimed, and this was very recent, this was the beginning of 2012, and a recent report that they put out claimed that they had an increased, how did they word it? They had an increased media production, increased personal productivity, which is always useful, and increased information literacy. But those points were really made by the instructors, and they were preliminary results. There's no quantitative data stating that at this point. So that's really just the instructor's perception of how things went so far with this study. But 450 students got iPads in that particular example. Seton Hall introduced it for all of their full-time faculty and all of their freshman students, and they actually reconfigured the whole campus in an attempt to create a mobile learning environment campus-wide. So they rewired the campus and made sure the internet access was strong enough for everybody to be using mobile devices everywhere on campus. Oklahoma State University, that's the one that's done the most quantitative reports so far. They were in 2010 that they did the study, and or that they did the pilot program, and they recently in 2012 put out a very quantitative report that talked about it. They used it for select classes, but there were quite a few classes they used it for. And the faculty and the students, 75% of the students, claimed that the iPads enhanced their learning experience overall. So most of the students felt that the introduction of the iPads in this particular way was very useful for them. And if you haven't heard, the University of New Haven has recently introduced iPads also into the classroom. And we used it specifically for the honors general chemistry class, which is what I'm going to talk with you about today. So we have introduced these iPads into the classroom. The iPads were introduced just to the honors general chemistry class, which is around 20 students. It was 19 last semester. We had one switch major, so it went down one this semester. So here they are, the first day that they got their iPads. They didn't know they were getting them. Okay, this was something that was sprung on them as a surprise. So this was the day they all found out they were getting them. Stephen, who's sitting in the back, looks very happy about his iPad. I've always loved that picture for that particular point. This is also the point in time that I think they thought it was going to be a lot of fun to get iPads because they're all smiling about it. And I don't think they realized at first, which we all don't when we get a new device, it's very fun to think about what we could do with it, that a lot of work was still going to go into the iPad use. It was just going to change how we did it. It wasn't going to change how much work we actually had to do in the process. So they're all happy for this picture, so I included this one. Oh, and I should say that this was headed up by Dr. Pauline Schwartz and Matt Ranovix from the Honors Program, and it was funded with, not donation, but it was funded by the Honors Program. So we've used it in the lecture, and we've used it in the lab. And I'm going to really focus on how we used it in the lab and incorporate it into the lab today. But I just want to mention how it was used in the lecture, in case anybody's curious about how they might incorporate this into their own classroom. So these are a few of the apps that were used. The first one is Nearpod. Nearpod is an app that is a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation app. And it was very useful. It was used early on. And it was useful because it allowed the instructor to be able to monitor what the students were doing. So the students could work on it, and the instructor could see what they were working on. If the student happened to get sidetracked, the instructor could see that that student was getting sidetracked. And it worked really well with a class of 19, opposed to a class of 82 or something of that sort, because you could actually see and watch what those 19 students were doing. So if they were working out a problem, the instructor could say, oh, it looks like, sorry, Stephen, you're here, so I'm going to use you. It looks like, Stephen, you're getting a little off course there. Maybe try using this value instead, or maybe look to this other example. So it really did allow that instant feedback and could really fill the instructor in on how the students were doing as they went along. It was very useful. The downside of Nearpod. We found out that when they used Nearpod, it didn't save any of their notes or any of their notations or any of their writing. So as soon as they closed the app and everybody moved forward, the students lost all the work they had done on Nearpod for that day. So they had to kind of keep paper off to the side and be writing things down as it went on also. And that's not really useful, to have to write on the iPad and have to write on the paper next to it to keep notes. So we ended up switching from Nearpod over to basically giving the students the presentations, the lecture notes, and the examples through Dropbox and Blackboard, which I'll talk about a little more. And then the students can annotate directly on those notes that are given to them. So creative clicker method was used. If you haven't come across this, I highly recommend it. I always wanted to incorporate clickers, and I always watched Dr. Swartz incorporate clickers into her classroom, and there was always so much work on the front end of incorporating clickers, because you have to create the PowerPoint, you have to use a special program, it has to work right, the clickers have to work, they have to be in the room, the batteries have to not be dead. There's all these different things that go along with getting the clickers to work. So as much as I wanted to use them for review, I never incorporated them just because of that little extra glitch in the process. And then I came across this particular app, and it's very, very useful. Let me click over to a picture of what the app looks like. And what it does is it allows you to kind of do an on-the-go clicker setup. So you have your, and this is on an iPhone, I believe, yeah, an iPhone and iPod. You can use it on an iPad, and you can use it on a computer also. And what it allows you to do is to set up this little room number, and then your students join you in that room number just by punching in the room number. So everybody's virtually in the same room and physically in the same room. And then I can pose a question. I could write it on the board, I could put it on the overhead, I can just ask you the question. It could be a multiple choice question, it could be a fill in the blank, it could be a work out the problem question. And then students can either write it in, this example here is a multiple choice, and students could choose A, B, C, D, or E. And what happens over here is whoever's in the room with me, it shows me that I have 82 students in the room at that time, and it shows me that I have 63 that have answered, then 74 that have answered, and now I see I have 80 students who have answered. And it shows me a graph of what they've answered. It's really useful because it allows you to give them instant feedback. So not only do they then know what to study for, but then you know where they're going wrong. So what misconceptions do my classes have on a whole about what I've been teaching them? So it really is a useful app, and it's very, very easy to incorporate into the classroom. There's one other thing I was going to say about this one. So I recommend everybody try that if you get some time. But on to other things. One of the other ones we used was MyPoint Pro. That's also a PowerPoint presentation app. What it allows you to do is carry the iPad around with you while you're lecturing and to be able to annotate on it. And it goes through the computer and then onto the screen through the projector. It's a great app. Downside of that particular app for me, and I'm sure you ran into similar things, I have to do a lot of calculations when I annotate and write out long numbers. And it's not very, doesn't have a very fine point with the writing. It's kind of very rough in its writing. So it's okay if I just want to kind of scribble on things or underline things or point to things, but not necessarily if I have to write out long numbers. But it does give me that freedom to get from behind the podium where I'm trying to record integrity and to be able to walk around the room and check out what everybody's doing. So it is useful for that method. We also had them use an ebook and the Learn Smart and Connect. So the ebook was the same book that the general chemistry class used anyway. It's just on their iPads instead. Learn Smart and Connect is offered by the publisher. It's online homework system. And the general population uses it on the computer. This particular class used it on their iPads. So the goal for using it in the laboratory, since that's what we're talking about today. So in the lab, it was decided that I'd use this technology to create a paperless lab. When we first got the iPads and it was announced that we were going to be trying to use these, it was over the summer. And I spent a lot of time wondering how I could work this in and that a way was actually useful to the students so that it wasn't just an electronic piece of paper so that I could have them play with it in a way that made it unique to them, but not go so far from what we expect from laboratory notebooks, because we really still have to teach the students the basics of record keeping in the lab. So it was important to incorporate that with the idea of this new device. And that's how I came up with the paperless lab aspect of it. What we did is we had no paper in the lab, so students did not use paper. They didn't get paper copies of the reports. They didn't print out paper copies of the reports, and I'll go through how we did this, but they would just get them electronically in the lab. No paper made its way in for any use this semester, and I was kind of mean about that a little bit at some points, right? Because I said, we got to really stick with what we're doing here. And then when they completed the final lab reports, we didn't use paper also. Everything was electronically done through the whole class. And the goal was to see how well this worked from a laboratory notebook setting, but how well the students actually enjoyed it. Is this something that they liked? Is it something that we just think that they're going to like because we think of them as a group of students who like technology? To date, when we started looking at research on this and I started figuring out how I was going to make this work, I really couldn't find a lot of undergraduate experiences of iPads making it into the laboratory. So we're one of the first groups who've used it as an electronic notebook in this type of way. It is being introduced, though, and it has been used in industry and commercial types of settings. It's made its way into forensics labs. Harris County Forensics used 20 iPads and dispersed them as a pilot program throughout the area to see if they could work those electronic notebooks into the labs. Research labs also use electronic notebooks, which the ELN, that's what that stands for. And that's been done for quite a while, except they've really been used in computers. So there's been programs out there like Agilent Software and Cambridge that have been taking computer and making programs for laptop computers for record keeping. Some of them were for the laptop to come into the lab, some of them were for the laptop to stay outside the lab, and then the researcher would go out and write in there. But laptops can be a little cumbersome when you're trying to work around a lab. Recently, there have been some iPad apps that I came across that are for that use. The problem with them is they're really created for a commercial type of experience. So they're linked to inventory, and they're linked to certain enzymes. They're really biologically based. So they really were for a commercial type of use. So when I thought about and tried playing with them and downloaded a whole bunch of them for a lot of money and then found out I wasn't going to use them, it really wasn't what we were looking to get out of it. I could see it being used in a commercial setting, but it wasn't what we were looking to get out of it. So it created a little bump in the road here of how am I going to then figure out how I want to work with this. As I was saying, it is important that those students get something specific from the lab, and one of those being record keeping and note keeping in that environment. Normally, a laboratory notebook is the primary record of research for a researcher or for a scientist. So we use notebooks to document hypothesis, to document data, to document the experimentation process, to start initial analysis of the results, calculations, and all of that's done to organize the data and to allow a researcher to be able to come back and say, okay, 5 years ago I tried this, or last year I tried it this way. So everything is kept very meticulously so that that can be utilized at a later time. There's also a legal aspect to lab notebooks. So it actually protects that researcher's intellectual property. So to ensure that that data isn't misrepresented, there's some different processes that these researchers use in the lab, like they always write in pen, so that you can't come and erase something and write it back in. And lab notebooks should be signed and dated, and the notations of crossing things out and writing things in are done in specific ways to kind of keep the integrity of the lab notebook as we go along. That's something we really try to instill in the students also, that value of the integrity of your work and keeping good notes, and would you be able to go back in 5 years and complete this lab report based on what you've written down so far? So we really still wanted them to get that. This is an example of what the students' paper notebooks would look like. So the freshmen and the sophomores keep notebooks this way. So they have a bound notebook that they use, and before they come to lab, they're required to read the procedure, to write it down in their own words in pen, to write down the purpose of the lab. When they get there, they're required to record all their observations, all their data in that notebook, so they can't write it on another piece of paper and transfer it over later. They're required to get signatures. They're required to do their calculations in there. So we really are specific about how we want these notebooks kept. And we actually have these guidelines that our freshmen and our sophomores get, maybe a little bit of variation for the sophomores. And we want them to get good lab notebook techniques so that when they go to their junior and senior classes, they have a good foundation. Okay, they have a good habits when it comes to lab notebooks. So we have, the course information. We make them keep a table of contents. We have, information on what they need to do before they come to lab, how they keep notes during lab, the notation process, how you cross something out and write something else in, whether you write on the right side, the left side. Every lab's a little bit different, but we've been picky about this at the freshman and sophomore level, and a way to get them ready for keeping their own notes at the junior and senior level. So I had to figure out how I wanted to take this and incorporate this into an iPad situation. So I spent a lot of time playing with those apps and working through them as if I was a student. So if I was a student, how would I get the material? How would I write down? Is this going to write well enough for me? Am I going to be able to do this in a lab? How would I then wrap this up? How do I make this permanent so that I can't just go in and change it at a later date? So I spent a lot of time going through and trying to figure those types of steps out as if I was a student. And these are the apps that we came up with to use. The first one, mobile Blackboard. So that's just our Blackboard done as an app on iPads and iPods. It allows them to just go in and get the materials that they need. So our general population, we take their lab reports. They don't have a notebook, or we don't have them buy a book. We post the reports for them on Blackboard, and they download them and bring them with them. We used UPad for the actual notebook, and I'll go through what exactly that looks like in the next slide. Dropbox was the place where the students would turn it in, and again, I'll show you how we went about that process. Cloud On was an app that we used, and we used it because it was free, and we found it one day in lab, and we're just like, oh, everybody quick, download this. It basically lets them use Microsoft, Excel, and PowerPoint for free. I don't know how that all worked. Maybe it's cost now, but I had everybody download it really quick just in case they started charging for it. And there is a little glitch in the saving process. It makes you save it in kind of funny places. But it did allow the students to occasionally open up Excel and punch data in to be able to get graphs if they needed it. So it was nice to have it. We had them use the Chemist app, and I'll show you about that in just a second. And the Vernier graphical analysis app was also used. We use Vernier, handheld Vernier units in the lab to collect data electronically. And what this did is it allowed us to use specific Vernier units, and then the data would be sent directly wirelessly over to the iPad. So we tried that. We're really trying that this semester because most of our Verniers come into play in the second half of the semester. But let me just show you Chemist, because this is really the only time I mention it. Chemist was a fun app. One of the things I was trying to make sure I was doing, there's my mouse here. I was trying to make sure that we kept it as a notebook, but we also kind of utilized the fact that it was an iPad and it was something that was fun and different. So this particular app we downloaded as a simulation app, and we had the students write lab reports as if they were writing them for 6th graders who had this app. So if we ever went to a school with our iPads, they could take them and run through a whole experiment using this particular simulation app. And it actually was a lot of fun. It had a lot of different components. You could set up titrations and gravimetric analysis. So they got really creative with it, and there were some really good experiments that came in that they used for this. It allows you to adjust the temperature and see what really happens when you adjust the temperature or change the pressure. One student used it in a really fun way. Instead of creating stuff, she blew stuff up with it, which at first when she came to me, I was like, I don't know if that's the best use for it. But then I started to think, students do always ask, are we going to blow things up in lab this semester? That's one of the big questions. And if you say yes, everybody really likes you. But we really don't get to do that. So she actually created a lab that showed the dangers of mixing certain chemicals together rather than going through an experiment that would already be there. So this will actually, and I don't have a animation of it, but it will actually blow up. You can set it so it will actually blow up when it's supposed to blow up. So it shows everything explode. So she had the students go through and see how much stuff they would have to add to get it to explode. And it was pretty creative, I thought. So she had a good time with that. So we did incorporate that as one of the assignments for this particular semester. All right, let me show you some of the other stuff. This is the notebook we used. This particular app was chosen, and there was a couple other ones we could have used, but this particular app was chosen because it allowed for a notebook section, a PDF section, and a photo section all in one app, and it was only $5. We did have the students buy just this one app because we figured they would have had to buy a notebook anyway for the class, and this was their notebook in its place. And what was important about this is they could go into lab and they could take notes actually in the notebook part. They could either annotate with a stylus or they could type it in, depending on how they wanted to work it. But one of the big things about lab notebooks is that they're permanent documents or semi-permanent documents. And normally, a lot of the apps, you could go back in and erase something that you had written and rewrite something in, and we don't want that to happen. So what the students were required to do was before they left the lab, they were required to take it and put it over into the second part of this app, which is referred to as BookPad. And what that did is it created a PDF file. And I'm sure you guys know from working with PDF files, they're much more difficult to change. If you change something on them, especially in this app, you see where it was changed. And that's what we want them to be able to do. We want to create these permanent files that have notations when they're changed and adjusted. So every day before they left, their notes were supposed to be turned over into BookPad. It also had this third part to it that was called PhotoPad, and they could take pictures and then put that in the particular app. They probably could just take pictures also with the device itself, but it was a little bit difficult to get it into the notebook if they wanted to take pictures that way. And that was actually really fun. I hadn't really thought about how great it would be to actually have visuals in their lab notebook rather than just trying to explain things. So we had the notebook where they would keep notes, the BookPad, which kept all PDFs, and they could annotate on the PDFs and organize their work, and then the pictures that they could keep. So this is generally how they were expected to work. They would download the experimental process from Blackboard. So they would go onto Blackboard and download the PDF file of what the experiment was going to be into BookPad, which I just showed you on the last slide. They would then take that report, go into Notepad, and write down the purpose and procedure for that day in their own words. And that's what everybody has to do. We require all the students to do that to make sure that they're prepared when they walk in the door. We don't want them walking in saying, what are we doing today? So that makes sure that at least at some aspect written down and thought about what they had to do that day. And they would do that in that drawing pad. They would then close the app and come to class, and drawing pad would be opened back up, and everything that they did that day would be kept in drawing pad also. So they could either write it in or type it in, however they wanted to work it. They could use different paper, they could use different colors, they could have a good time with it. So they recorded all of that in drawing pad, and they could add photos in if they wanted to. And then before they left, they were supposed to move all the files into one specified folder in BookPad. So they'd have a folder in BookPad that would be called Density Experiment Number 1. And their report was supposed to go in there, the notebook was supposed to go in there, everything would be in that one folder. Then they'd go back to Blackboard and pull down the report. And that's what all of our students do. They go to Blackboard and get the procedure, they go to Blackboard and get the report. And then they would fill out the report using BookPad, using the annotation in the UPad app, and turn that in through Dropbox. So I'll show you what that kind of looks like. So here's an example of some of the lab notebooks. So this particular student has incredible handwriting. I won't show you some of the other ones. And I'll talk about the handwriting as being one of the aspects that was a little bit frustrating for some of the students as we went along. So this is what the student would have written up, most of it. She left boxes here before she came in. And then when she came in, she recorded everything and wrote all these numbers down. So the blue and the black mostly were what she would have written beforehand. And then when she came in, she would fill in everything else in. All right, so she has all of her procedure in her own words, her amounts, her masses that she used, the table that we recommend they put in there, and her initial conclusions are all going into that notepad. And then she would move it over to BookPad before she left. We always checked the students' notebooks to make sure that they were keeping them as they went along. Here's a second student, and I put hers in because she was really into using the photos. And this particular one, you probably can't see it from way back there, but you can see this was a reaction, and we were looking at the solubility of substances and whether or not we get precipitates when we mix two things together. So this student, instead of writing down what she was seeing, she actually took a picture of every one of her mixtures so that she could go back and look at what happened and not just visualize or not just describe what happened in words. And she did this on most of her labs, so it was really fun looking at her lab notebook. This is a couple of the students in the lab working with them, and I stuck this in there because I wanted to point out the fact that we had the students take the iPads and put them in Ziploc bags when they were in the lab. And we actually found that in one of the papers that we were looking through when we were looking for research on this. One of the medical schools recommended doing this. When they're in the Ziploc bag, they're still sensitive to your touch, so they still work, mostly. They still work when you put them in the Ziploc bags. It's a little tough because sometimes the Ziploc bag moves with you. So a few students did get frustrated with it and actually took them off and just had their iPads in the lab. But that was their call. We always had the Ziploc bags available for them. The first few weeks they all used it, and then we kind of let them figure out what they wanted to do as they went along. But it just protected them from spills, from getting wet, and that type of thing. Lab's kind of a dirty place. After they were done, and as I was mentioning here, they take those files and put them over to BookPad to make them permanent PDF files. Then they would go to Blackboard and find their assignment, because they still haven't even done their assignment. They've just done the experiment now. So they'd go pull up the report, and they would fill it out. So this is what all of our students' reports look like. It's just the students in this honors class would fill them out electronically rather than doing it by hand. So this is an example of one of our informal reports. We have a mixture of formal and informal reports for the honors group. So the student would just take it and annotate on it, and then they would turn it in. So this is an example of what one of those looks like. When they would turn it in, they would turn it in through Dropbox. So at the beginning of the semester, I created shared folders with every single student in the class, and that's where they would put in their assignment. It was useful in the sense that it created a timestamp for me so that I knew when everybody turned it in, because it would say, you know, this got put in Thursday afternoon at 3 o'clock, and everything was due by Friday. So I was always able to go back and see when the student turned it in. There was never any problems that way. But every single one of them, you know, if I'm talking about Ashley here, both Ashley and I can see her lab reports, but nobody else in the class can. So I had them on the first day of class send me a link for a shared file. I shared the file with them, and that's where we would put all of our data. I don't know how many people have used Dropbox. It's basically an internet folder system or data storage system, and it's accessible through the internet rather than just being on your computer. One of the big things that was important that I figured out later on was that it was really important that they write it in the right name, so that they create a specific name for that file, or it was very difficult for me to figure out what file was what. So if you look down here, actually with Steven's name, this is just the folders examples, but it shows me the beginning of the name, and then it shows me a bunch of dots, and then it shows me the end of his name. The lab reports have very long names, so it would just show me the first couple letters and then the last couple letters, and I could never figure out what experiment was what, because they always started it with experiment number, so EXP was always the beginning, and then DOC or PDF or whatever was what I saw at the end. So it was really important that I had them change things around. They had to put their last name in it and that type of thing, and that was something it was hard to get that working, but we finally did get it to work, and it was a very important part of the whole process. What I would do is go into Dropbox, open it up in UPad, and correct it. So all of my annotations would be done directly on the lab report, and then I would just put it back in the folder, in the shared folder, and it would go override the previous one. So then they would have their corrected report in the folder. So student response to the whole process. So despite being the millennial generation, comfortable with the use of modern technology, we did encounter a pretty steep learning curve early on that I did not anticipate happening. So here's a few of the problems they mentioned, and then I'll talk about a couple of the problems I came across individually. I don't like how difficult it is to write. I got used to it after a while and a lot of practice, but at the beginning it was very difficult to write without my palm touching the screen. And that's true for a lot of those apps where you use the annotation. As soon as your hand hits the screen, it sees that as a touch and moves the screen around. So that was one of the difficulties that we ran into. And once the students got good at it and figured out how to hold their hand, it kind of went away. But there was quite a few weeks where I heard everybody moaning and groaning and complaining about it in lab, because every time they try to write something and they're trying to do their experiment, every time they'd write something it didn't work, oh God, and having to go back and kind of start it over. The inability to look at 2 pages simultaneously or compare quickly between data separated over several pages hinders my work. And then another student said, I really am not a fan of the constant flipping back and forth between DrawPad and BookPad, or between documents to complete lab reports. I wish you could have 2 up at the same time. My initial response to this was boo-hoo. Like, you got to press one button and open up another button. Like, that's not that difficult for you. But then I started trying it, and I realized it actually is kind of a pain. So you'd have to close it, and then it would want to start over. So there was this area where we were like, it's not like a computer where you can actually have 2 windows open at the same time and be working. So we did figure out, though, later on that you could kind of press a button and just get it to scoot off to the side and then get it to come back up later. But there was this period of time nobody really knew how to do that, and it was like a lot of frustration with closing things down, going over to look at your PDF file, and then having to go back and get it all to reopen again. So there was a little bit of a learning curve. And that's really what I mentioned here, was moving swiftly between those apps was a little difficult for students at the beginning. So that's what they mentioned. This was an early set of surveys that we took from them, just asking them their rough feelings about it about 3 weeks into the class. These are what I realized they had trouble with. The file names. It was so difficult to get everybody on board with the file names. I think it was one of those small attention to detail issues that they just overlook by that point. They've already written the report, they've already done all the work, they just want to give it to you. I don't want to have to worry about the file name. So it finally came down to, at the end of the semester, I was just like, I'm taking points off now for the file names, and then miraculously everybody got it that week. So that was a big issue, was getting everybody on board with those file names. They also had to use Dropbox as a PDF. If they didn't put it in there as a PDF, then I wasn't able to open it and annotate on top of it in UPad. So I was constantly saying, you got to put it in PDF, you got to put it in PDF. And they were putting it over there as docs or as UPads, and that was a little bit difficult for a while to get everybody on board with that. And they thought I was too picky about the lab notebook process. So I showed you a couple slides back about how we really are on them about how they keep their lab notebooks and the details on how to keep the lab notebooks. And I think that they thought I was just doing that to them because of the iPads. Little did they know I bother everybody just as much as I bother them about that. So that was a universal thing. But a lot of them linked it to the iPad and not just the fact that I was mean about how you keep your notebook. There's a couple of obstacles I realized when I was grading also that were a bit of a pain. Dropbox, originally I had created these all as subfolders, but I realized when I would try to go back and put things in Dropbox and override their previous folders, that UPad wouldn't let me look at subfolders. It would only let me look at higher level folders. So I had to go back in and pull everybody's to a higher level folder, and then I could put their data back in or put their lab reports back in. But sometimes they would create subfolders for themselves to organize their labs, and then I couldn't override the previous one because I couldn't get access to the subfolders through UPad. Grading was as much fun as I thought it was going to be. When I would go back and put things in, UPad would try to change the name on me so that I couldn't override. And I just had this idea that I really wanted to override the previous file. It's probably something you don't have to do. But I didn't want to have 2 copies in there of everything. I wanted there to be 1 copy for the student to be able to go directly and see their grade, not them having to search through things. So every single time I went back and put something in, I had to subtract this 1 to 2 by UPad little notation. So just a little tedious thing that I'd have to do every time. So that was one of the things I might, if we ever try something different, I see if I can overcome that. Here's just a couple of the responses for you, just to have an idea of how the students felt about it. This is part of our survey. I believe it's enhanced the lab experience. It forces you to use technology. I like forces. Not this was great to use the technology, but it forced us to use the technology whether you really want to or not. And it makes you learn about the different types of technologies on the iPad. It's difficult to adjust, but you learn the value of it and how great it really is. Using the iPad has been a positive experience, a stepping stone to a paperless future, because we did talk with them about how it is getting incorporated in more industry. I also like it because it was easy to organize. I can separate my documents, color code things, make visuals. So some of them really went to town on some of the drawings, and they used all their pretty colors and the pretty paper, and they really had a good time with it. There are many tools at my fingertips, like writing, colors, highlighters, apps like timers, periodic tables, web access, undo, redo buttons that made things very quick and easy. Overall, I believe the exposure to the device, Overall, I really appreciate exposure to the devices. I believe being versed in this tool will make me more competitive in the labor force later. I love being able to take screenshots, pictures of the lab tables. They would actually, I don't know why we didn't figure this out earlier, when I would do the pre-lab on the board, they would just start taking pictures of it, save them some writing. So they loved being able to take the screenshots, copy it right into their notebook. It helps my notebook look neat and organized. And that's one of the things about the paper notebooks. A lot of them want to rip it out after because it looks sloppy and rewrite it in, and that defeats the whole purpose of a lab notebook. So they did like that they could kind of keep things neat as they went. Saves paper, and of course, nice, direct, to the point. I love this iPad, thank you. We just started collecting some quantitative data just this last week from the students because we're getting to the end of the experience. So I'll just kind of show you some of their feedback on this. I prefer to use to keep the lab notebooks in place of paper notebooks. And we did this on the lecture too, but since we're talking about the lab, I've just included the lab here. So most of them strongly agree that they preferred the lab notebooks to what they knew about the paper notebooks. They've never had an experience with a paper notebook before though, so this is their only experience. I believe the camera and the video function enhanced the process. So most of them agree or strongly agree on that. I believe I'm more organized because of the iPad, and most of them strongly agreed with that statement. I believe the iPad required more attention to detail than a paper notebook would, and that's what I was mentioning to you. They really thought that I was on them about the iPad when it was really how they keep notebooks that was important. And then this was my curiosity. I was wondering how they felt about this. So a lot of them thought they actually had to do more work because of the iPad or more attention to detail because of the iPad. And I don't necessarily think that's true. They prefer the lab notebooks being handed in, or the lab reports being handed in electronically. They prefer the electronic grading system to the paper system. And the use of Dropbox helped me keep my lab reports organized. So all of them agreed with that statement in regards to the lab. And it improved my overall experience. This one I actually kind of threw in as a little bit of a trick question to see if everybody was reading what they were doing instead of just putting strongly agree. So I asked them if it improved their experience, and then I asked them if they made their experience more difficult. So they agreed here, and then most of them disagreed over here. So that was nice to know that they were actually reading the survey as they were going along. So the Paperless Lab approach afforded by the use of the iPads in the laboratory lessened the environmental impact of conducting labs. So normally, on average, we saved more than 120 pieces of paper per student over the course of just one semester. So if you think we have 330 students who have gone through lab just this year for Gen Chem, so that's a lot of paper that we would use. And our feedback in regards to the lab has been overwhelmingly positive once we got over that bit of the learning curve at the beginning of the semester. So overall, it really was a positive experience. We did get to try something new, create this paperless lab, which is most likely something they're going to be exposed to as they go out into industry later. And then we got to play a little bit at the same time with apps like Chemist and trying different things. So that's it. Any questions, guys?